19-year-old.
Modernism was
very glad to be in Los Angeles right now as an art maker, as an artist.
I'm in Los Angeles talking to Douglas Fogle, who is a curator in LA, and my question, Douglas, is what was modernism?
What was modernism? It's a very complicated question. I think everyone has a very different take on it, and of course there's many stories, and then actually, more importantly, I would stress there are many modernisms.
Yeah.
While I was at the Walker Art Center from 1994 till 2005, we actually had asked ourselves that question very early in relationship to the collection. And what we decided was that we would start talking about plural notions of modernisms,
yeah,
as opposed to a singularity or a singular modernism. And that guided us in trying to decide how to build the collection historically, which we could only do very strategically because it was not MoMA. We did not have the same sort of resources that a museum like MoMA did, but we had decent resources. And we started identifying a few moments in the post-war period that we wanted to focus on as ways to move forward with contemporary art, because it was really, we did all sorts of things. We did 20th century and mostly post-war. And we chose a few areas, one of which was Japan in the post-war period. We began collecting Gutai material.
Yeah.
We began looking at Brazil and neo-concretism in the 50s as well. We were looking at performative influenced European post-war sort of movements like Fluxus, but also Viennese actionism. We were looking at questions of painting and destruction of painting. So to define modernism is tough, but I think that in a way I was sort of raised intellectually at the Walker Art Center with the idea that you challenge that notion from the beginning, even though there is a canonical sort of version of it.
One of the things I actually teach is the first year undergraduate program in art theory, and the thing we start with is that canonical history of modernism. It's difficult, I think, to teach in some respect, because you also want the students to be aware throughout that this is a single, problematic history.
Yeah, there's the great Alfred Barr's great charts, his flow chart of modernisms, I guess he would have called it maybe that, of modernism that he made for an exhibition, I forget which.
MoMA.
It was early on in
exhibition,
MoMA.
first
Yeah.
one at MoMA, I think, yeah.
And that chart is very interesting in terms of trying to make connections between suprematism and neoplasticism and Russian constructivism and revolutionary avant-garde versus whatever, and people divide it up different ways. Some people talk about the advent of modernism in terms of Picasso and a kind of formalist take, or the way things have come out of that, and then on the other side, constructivism and Dada, and the more political, even though constructivism of course has a lot of formal, the question of the content of the form becomes very crucial when looking at the abstraction coming out of constructivism and neoplasticism and things like that. So even within European canonical modernism, there's many stories and debates and questions and whatnot. And if you have Dada on one side, how do you deal with synthetic cubism at the same time over here? And you deal with the Russian avant-garde over here, but then after Stalin and what happened, there's so many questions. But what we had received at that time, the received canon when I was a student, and then was Clement Greenberg here in the States, of course.
Of course.
That's what we immediately were working against, even in as an undergraduate, reading those essays. Very important, really very important essays in many ways that you can find a lot of positive things in, but also a lot of exclusions. And being in Los Angeles now, as opposed to being in New York, of course, the story of Los Angeles has always been the third or fourth sibling to New York in terms of the center of the art world internationally after the World War II.
Yeah.
So that, the Getty just sponsored $11 million of exhibitions all over Southern California to investigate that history across the disciplines of design, architecture, art, and pretty much every institution in town, small and big, did something about that history from the post-war period to 1980. And it was, it was always seen as a very neglected, undervalued contributor to a larger discussion about modernity and contemporary art from the 60s on. Art Forum magazine was started in Los Angeles and moved to New York in the 60s.
Right, I didn't realize that.
So there was, it was always seen as a very sort of second sister kind of thing to New York, and it's a very different situation now. But to go back to what I was saying, the very important thing I think that we started thinking about in the 90s with many of our colleagues around the world, and we had a committee of people from all over the place that would come to Minneapolis and brainstorm with us, was the question of, the lack of a global vision for the definitions of modernism and how much was left out, how many parallel practices there were in South America and Asia and so on and so forth, and just even choosing a few things for us to focus on to try to broaden the story of modernisms was, I think, a real contribution to that collection, but also to an ongoing constant reevaluation of what these stories are, and who's telling the story.
Did you find there was difficulty in knowing exactly where to demarcate how far you spread from that canonical kind of core of that
mostly
bar?
Sure, that mostly had to do, I'm sure, with resources. I mean, to a certain extent, an institution, when you're in it and you're building a collection, you have certain limitations if you don't have unlimited resources, which we did not. We had $1.5 million US a year based on an endowment that we had. We didn't have to ask people for money. Maybe it was a little less than that some years, a little more other years. But we had to build a strategy over like a 10-year period of what we were going to do historically as opposed to buying contemporary art, by living artists. Or continuing our relationships with certain artists who had we'd begun collecting in the 60s, for example. And that's where, we were able to, the leadership of Kathy Halbreich, who's now at MoMA as the Associate Director, and Richard Flood, who's now the Chief Curator at Large, I believe, at the New Museum. They were the leaders there that we were all working with, and it was really about finding and identifying these movements and or specific places we wanted to add work by, and getting them under the market before the market caught them and they were priced into billionaire collector territory. So we were able to buy Gutai material for a fifth or less than that even of what those paintings are going for today. We were able to, because of the relationship of the institution to a few artists from the 60s who had their first shows coming over from Europe, we were able to buy things, from the estate, this and that, before the market went really crazy in the late 90s and the teens.
Because that was one of the things I was thinking, that, you're actually talking about collecting a sort of a bracketed sort of period that has been incredibly, hugely overly inflated really in the art
now. For sure. And, and there were moments that we sort of missed a few things too, because we wanted to buy an Oiticica sculptural relief work, and at the time were not able to do it for various reasons, and now the market's radically changed, especially in the case of Helio Oiticica, where there was a really horrible fire at a storage facility and much historical work was lost down in Brazil. So now that's, it's very hard to find the right work at the right time, from the right period for him. And, but we were able to get amazing Gutai material. We were able to get amazing, an amazing collection of Fluxus material. We were able to add a number of, and because that definition also cut across in disciplines. And that was another way we were thinking about modernisms, was looking at someone like John Cage, who had an intimate relationship with the Walker Art Center from the 60s on, and looking at the artists he collaborated with, like Jasper Johns, and acquiring the set that Jasper Johns did for a very important piece, which is, my brain is not remembering, Walk About Time. A very important performance that the John Cage Company did, and it's a stage set with sort of plastic inflatable sculptures based on Duchamp's large glass, tying Jasper Johns to Duchamp, bringing John Cage in. Then one starts to activate the idea of performativity in Duchamp, as well as in, you know, Johns and whatnot. And there's all of these kind of blurring of boundaries are not simply about regional or I should say global sort of positioning where one is, but also about breaking down boundaries between disciplines, which some definitions of modernism don't like to do.
No.
And some
Greenbergian.
Exactly. And then Clement Greenberg is the primary example of that. And then some people who would define modernism would be it's about that kind of synesthesia. It would be like the farthest reach on the other side of it, of what the modern experience could be in terms of contemporary art. So.
Do you see that in Los Angeles there is a resurgence of abstraction, do you think? Have you observed this? Is that a leading question? Maybe it is. It's not
a leading question, but I think the question of abstraction is very interesting right now, and I think that it's not just in Los Angeles. I was just thinking about this the other day. When is abstraction abstraction? And who was I thinking about the other day? I was writing something. There's the young painter here, painter, it's not even a painter, sculpture painter, video maker, named Julian Hober, and I was talking with him a couple of weeks ago, and he does very figurative works. He's done a sculpture recently, which is an immersive environment, so it's very performative. It's based on the sort of fun house, optical illusion houses that get built at various tourist sites or whatever. You walk in, it looks like a ball is rolling uphill because you're actually like this. And there's a very famous one in Santa Cruz, California, where I went to school, university, and then I was professor, visiting faculty member there, teaching art history for a couple of years. And there's a very famous one from the 40s that was built there that he knew about. And he built this one in a very Donald Judd kind of aesthetic. And he called it Demon Hill, riffing off of the Demon Hill collection. You know, and playing with modernism, playing with all these things. It's an abstract work in many ways, and it's completely not abstract work. The lighting fixtures are Flavin-ish.
Right. Okay.
Judd, you know, the question whether Judd and Flavin would be considered modernist is a whole other issue. But in LA, I mean, abstraction is something that I really think that there's such a blurring of that line now too. Like, what is abstraction? What is formal kind of consideration, and what is content driven? That's one of the things that's happening all over. I don't think it's just here. Whether it's someone working cinematically, where the time-based work or narrative, you know, there are people working in pure abstraction in that field. But at the same time, you know, trying to think of another good example of where you draw the line between these things. When is the figure not a figure anymore? You know, it's like I was just writing something about Hans Bellmer and thinking about the Poupée sculptures, and then thinking about someone like Sarah Lucas with her sort of nylon sculptures that are stuffed, or thinking about Louise Bourgeois, or thinking about a lot of these artists who've like taken abstraction and figuration and made a real friction between them in a very interesting way. And there's just so much there. I don't think it's ever either or.